Hi, everyone. Welcome to your next session at Microsoft Ignite. My name is Jeffrey Moore. I am the lead cloud architect for this concept called Azure VMware Solution. It's a solution that provides a VMware stack inside an Azure data center, and we'll take the technical approach of applying it to a use case around the current economic uncertainty around COVID and talk about things like the support of remote working and, more importantly, how we have this digital-first business moving forward. So maybe some quick background on my side. Again, my name is Jeffrey Moore. I'm a U.S. citizen, although I'm based in Munich, Germany, and my current focus is on the Microsoft partnership. I have a number of different certifications related to networking, although my real background is around networking, storage, and compute. As I mentioned, my main focus is around Microsoft, so my current technical focus is around the Azure VMware solution, although in the past I have focused on VMware Cloud and AWS, Google Cloud VMware Engine, as well as a number of VCPP partners. I have a number of years of experience, and my certification also includes things like AWS certifications, Google, as well as, and more importantly, Microsoft. To maybe frame up the discussion that we're going to have today, again, it will be a technical discussion, although to apply it to the current pandemic situation that we have globally. Pat Gelsinger, RCO at VMware, has talked about this business as usual approach throughout the whole situation to really not only help each other, but help customers transform or adapt through this process of going through a global pandemic while maintaining their business continuity. So we'll try to build on top of this concept that Pat talks about through a number of different discussions applied to this use case. It really is a journey going through what we're experiencing today with the global pandemic. So what we normally talk about with customers is the ability to go through different phases to maintain that business continuity. So the first thing we have to do is respond to the situation. And that really means maintaining that business operational model through the time of crisis. It could really mean anything from being able to adapt to remote workers or to be able to secure data that you have that might be distributed. It's really the first step or first phase in a situation that we're currently experiencing. The second phase is really adapt. So once I respond, how do they then move forward and be resilient? And it's really about the idea of being able to maintain your business growth and also optimize things like cost, eliminate complexity, as well as focus on things like inefficiencies and redundancy. And then the final phase is around accelerate. So as we move through respond and then begin to adapt, and once we create kind of a baseline through this current COVID situation, how do we start to accelerate our business to really build a digital-first model for both IT and business? So we'll talk about these three phases in more detail as we move forward and talk about how AVS or Azure VMware Solution can help us with that. So the first phase is really about respond. So if we look at the workforce, it was really about how do we rapidly adapt a distributed workforce that typically would go into an office or into a data center and now are working remotely. So how do we adapt to that or respond to that and be able to rapidly change in that type of situation? And this really leans towards the second column around cloud. So cloud can really provide things such as additional expansion of capacity inside another data center. So we can, what I would call control burst into a cloud offering that provides that same operational consistency between on-prem and the cloud. So AVS is really that. Azure VMware Solution, we'll talk about that later, but it really is a VMware Cloud Foundation stack sitting on top of Azure hardware inside an Azure data center. So the operational model provides that consistency between on-prem and the cloud. Okay, so as we move through this type of situation, we're quickly trying to respond. How do we quickly adapt to the situation by increasing capacity and at the same time allowing people to do everything remotely? So that really addresses the need for cloud in this situation, Azure VMware Solution. And then more importantly, it does surface some concerns that we've had on-prem between maybe two different data centers related to disaster recovery, but it does surface that quite a bit because now in a situation where we may have to evacuate a certain region due to the pandemic, we might have to also consider DR solutions that provide that into a different location like Azure VMware Solution. And then the app's really about how do we start to provide access to external resources across distributed teams that can accelerate that development. As we can imagine, we might have situations where developers were in an office doing development. We've gone through the COVID situation. They need to quickly respond to that by building a distributed system from a centralized location on-prem into a distributed situation where we can have it both on-prem and in the cloud where they can access that remotely. So it's really about being able to respond to the immediate need. One piece that was quite evident is the ability to provide desktop support outside of an office or a data center. So there is this platform at VMware called Horizon Cloud. It allows us to support a virtual desktop infrastructure inside Microsoft native Azure. It's run as a service, so Microsoft maintains that infrastructure for you. You, the customer, bring those workloads into the Horizon Cloud environment, although Microsoft maintains that infrastructure for you. So it provides a means for customers, employees, to have their access to their typical Windows environment inside the native Azure cloud environment, again, to respond to that immediate need from a COVID or pandemic crisis. Okay, so again, this is a solution built on top of VMware Horizon Cloud for native Azure from Microsoft. The other solution is something by VMware called Horizon 8. This is something that traditionally has been installed on-premise, so it does provide that virtual desktop infrastructure on-prem, and now can be expanded into Azure VMware solution in the cloud. The good thing about this is it does allow us to maintain that operational consistency between what we currently have on-prem using Horizon 8 into the cloud using AVS. So that's quite important, and it also allows the customer to control the Horizon infrastructure from an administrative perspective. So how they would deploy it on-premise and maintain that or manage that infrastructure would have the same approach or operational consistency as far as they have on AVS. One question I get is, should I go through the VMware Horizon Cloud or VMware Horizon 8 path? It really depends on the requirements. So if you have a requirement where you, the customer, want to have Microsoft maintain that Horizon infrastructure and you just bring the workloads, Horizon Cloud on native Azure probably is a better path. If you want to maintain that operational consistency where you currently have Horizon 8 on-prem, although you'll also want to run that in the cloud, here being Azure VMware solution, then VMware Horizon 8 on ABS would be a better route. And then the second phase is really about adapt. So we've gone through the respond, now we're going into the adapt. So how do I evolve my current infrastructure that I might have on-prem and build some kind of hybrid strategy? So we talked about the virtual desktop infrastructure in the previous slides, and it's also about being able to expand other things like network connectivity. How do I run a 3-tier app between on-prem and the cloud? Maybe I put my web tier onto the cloud side and keep my app and DB database tiers on-prem. And really, it's about the ability to scale up to the cloud, whether or not you buy a committed resource in the cloud or pay-as-you-go on demand. It's also about cost optimization. So how do I reduce my potential footprint that I have on-premise to save on potential OpEx and maybe move it into an Azure VMware solution where I can use that as an infrastructure as a service, again, to mitigate or reduce the overall cost for running my environment from a data center perspective. And then, again, the idea of unifying operations to eliminate inefficiencies and costs. One thing that people talk about is, as I move into the cloud, do I need to reskill my operational team? Do I need to reorganize my architecture and design team to understand what it means from a native public cloud perspective versus what I'm running on-prem from vSphere? So Azure VMware solution really allows us to maintain that design consistency or operational consistency between on-prem and the cloud, and they can also leverage the same skill set that they have today. And then from an apps perspective, it's really about being able to drive that consistent application consistency. How am I developing applications on-prem, and how do I want to also engineer applications in the cloud? How do I change my application processes for development? How do I reskill my software engineers to understand one environment versus the other? So by leveraging Azure VMware solution, we can maintain that application consistency as we move between on-prem and the cloud. And then even things like content catalogs, which is native to vSphere on-prem, we can use that same concept in AVS and even link it to the same content library if needed that was on-prem. So again, it provides that flexibility for operational and application consistency. Essentially, what is Azure VMware solution? As I mentioned before, at a high level, we're using a VMware Cloud Foundation framework that deploys things such as vCenter, NSXT Manager. You can use this concept called Hybrid Cloud Extension, or HCX, which we'll talk about next. And it builds that infrastructure on top of Azure hardware inside Azure Data Center. So if you're running VMware Cloud Foundation or a vSphere environment on-prem, it's the exact same experience that you would have in the cloud from a operation and a management perspective. It's based on a cloud-validated design. So VCF, or VMware Cloud Foundation, is validated by VMware, and it's also being cloud verified by VMware. So that's quite important for consistency. It's a little bit different where Microsoft does do the lifecycle management, so they own the solution, even though it's a VMware stack, they own the solution in their own data center, and they own that end-to-end customer support. So they own level 1, level 2, and then we maintain from a VMware perspective layer 3 if they have to escalate. And the use case is really about data center lift and shift or extensions. Again, we can do network extensions, which we'll talk about next. Migrations, application modernization, as we talked about before. As we move into the cloud, how do we also modernize? And then disaster recovery, I think it, again, brings those topics back up to the top level regarding if we do have to evacuate a region, how do we do that efficiently? And how can we do that with Azure VMware solution as a secondary data center? And then optimizing cost and management. So this is a important piece as we go through a situation like that, as we're trying to move things into a new environment to gain additional capacity and diversity from a data center perspective. How do we optimize resources? The good thing about Azure VMware solution, it allows us a single pane of glass for the consumption of the service itself. So the exact same vCenter that we had on-premise, we now have in the cloud. The exact same NSXT manager that we may have on-prem is the exact same thing that we have on the cloud side. And then if there's a need to do it through the Azure portal, we can also use something like Azure Arc to maintain or control the VMs that are running in AVS. For those who don't know what Azure Arc is, it's an extension of the Azure Resource Manager for data center resources that are outside Azure, and AVS is included in that. So if you want to power up, power down VMs or be able to control the memory capacity, you can do that through Azure Arc. The on-scale demand, again, the idea here is if you want to do a control burst, people like to talk about bursting, but I always talk about control burst, meaning that if I know that my capacity is increasing over a certain period of time and I know that after X number of months, it'll hit a limit on my on-prem data center, then I can burst into the cloud, or I should say control burst into the cloud by leveraging AVS. The typical scenario here may be around the holiday season where in December or January, I want to be able to have that additional capacity from a data center perspective, and I can use Azure VMware solution for that. The good thing is that we can do a pay-as-you-go billing, so if you only need it for that 2 months, you can do that, although there are other contracts, 1 year and 3 year commits, but you can also do pay-as-you-go. And then cost efficiency, it really depends what you consider cost efficiency, although we can do or look at the security updates for things like Windows Server 2008 R2 or SQL Server 2008 R2. If those are being run on-prem, we can get those free security updates by running them in AVS. And then the Microsoft hybrid use benefit, again, bringing Windows or SQL Server from on-premise into Azure through their software assurance program, we can leverage those licenses as we move into the cloud. And then total cost of ownership, this really talks about 3 main concepts here. On-demand scaling, we talked about that. How do we increase and decrease between on-prem and the cloud? How do we get that additional capacity? Although it could be that once we do get into a cloud solution such as AVS, can we increase and decrease our cluster? So the answer to that is yes. Let's say you sign up for a 3-year commit contract for a 4-node environment, and you find out after the first couple of years you need an additional capacity. You can increase and decrease your environment as needed. The reduced capital investments, I think that's a large part of the overall concept. As we move from on-prem to the cloud and leverage an infrastructure as a service, I can now reduce my capital investment that I have on-prem and put that towards the cloud. And again, it reduces your operational expenditures for that, but it also allows you to reduce your overall CapEx and OpEx from a data center perspective. And then this says fast pass to the cloud. I think that's quite accurate. I think some customers have found out that moving into the cloud sometimes, as I mentioned, requires rescaling of their teams or changing their applications, that type of thing. So moving into Azure VMware solution, again, provides that same VCF feel and environment that you have on-prem into the cloud and allows you to quickly migrate into a public cloud environment maintained here by Microsoft versus having to re-architect all your applications. So again, quite important. And then the final thing is after we go through the first 2 phases of respond and adapt, how do we accelerate? How do we move our customer forward to be able to provide better models, not only for themselves, but also for their employees? So as we know, employees have adapted to the environment where they have to work from home. They're doing remote workshops. They're having customer engagements via different conferencing solutions such as MS Teams. So it really provides that new employee engagement. It really also provides a new type of workforce service where we've learned to do everything remotely. Of course, the human factor face-to-face is better, but we've learned that a large percentage of the work that we do can be done remotely via video conferencing. And then how do we expand our cloud strategy? So we may be running 2 different data centers on-prem, 2 different private clouds on-prem. We have everything set up from a DR perspective. We know how to migrate back and forth. We want to maintain that operational consistency in the cloud. Now we can purchase or look at 2 AVS SDDC instances. And instead of having 2 physical data centers, now we have 2 virtual data centers running in Azure on AVS and maintain that operational consistency. Again, just trying to replicate everything from an operational team perspective, an architecture team perspective, and a design team perspective. And then including that around the applications. So one thing that we talk about from an AVS perspective is the functionality of the vSphere stack within the Azure data centers, although really it's also about being able to provide consistency between what you have on-prem and the cloud. So what are you doing from operational and application design consistency? And as you do that, as you move into AVS, your applications also need to be modernized or reevaluated or consuming new services from Azure. So the good thing is that because AVS or Azure VMware Solution sits inside the native Azure data centers, we can consume all the native services directly from Azure, such as Active Directory, artificial intelligence, etc. Okay, so it allows a way for our applications to become future-proof by leveraging these additional services from Azure. So quickly, from an HCX perspective, we talked about this early on. HCX is Hybrid Cloud Extension. This is a service that allows us to easily migrate from one data center into another data center. It can be between 2 different physical data centers on-prem, and it can also be between data centers on-prem and the cloud. In this situation, it would be for Azure VMware Solution. It goes all the way back to vSphere 5.0, so it is backwards compatible. And the main use case is migration for things like DC consolidation and evacuation. It does allow for a multi-cloud strategy. As I mentioned, if you wanted to have 2 different private clouds on-prem and also 2 virtual data centers in AVS, we can mesh the HCX service between the different cloud environments to provide that migration service. But more importantly, it's about business continuity, going back early to what we talked about in the use case, and that could potentially be about disaster recovery. For, again, if we had to evacuate a certain region, we could use AVS as a disaster recovery target. One thing I will mention about one of the advantages around HCX is as we do migrations, a big concern that customers have are about the IP addresses of their workloads. In the past, developers may have hard-coded the IP addresses into their software versus using something like DNS names. So there's a concern that as we move into the cloud, we may need to preserve that IP address space. So HCX supports as a service. It will deploy an appliance for you on-prem if you want to extend a network. It deploys an appliance and does a network extension from on-prem into the cloud. Why? As you move VMs from on-prem to the cloud, you can maintain that network connectivity between the 2 different data centers where your on-prem is the source and your target is AVS. And you can maintain that IP address space because we have full network connectivity. The benefits of HCX, again, we have different options for migration, but we do have an option for zero downtime. So if you want to migrate from the on-prem into the cloud and it's a critical application, you can migrate it with a zero downtime approach. And you can also migrate back from Azure VMware Solution back to on-prem if that's necessary. And the good thing about it is it really simplifies an overall migration process for you. If anybody's gone through the process of migrating from one data center to another, it's very time-consuming from a technical and logistical perspective. This allows us to quickly plan and schedule migrations through the tool itself. So it really mitigates any risk regarding the overall time to get from point A to point B. And then, as I mentioned before, the seamless integration with Azure native services. This is quite important. So as we move things in the cloud, if we want to leverage native Azure services, we have full layer 3 connectivity into that. So things like artificial intelligence, I think I mentioned Active Directory, everything is fully accessible from the AVS environment for additional services. So this is quite important, again, to future-proof your applications or your business that might be growing. You can leverage these additional services in the native cloud. And then maybe just to go back to what we talked about before, these again are the 3 main phases that we talked about. How do we respond to a certain situation regarding the global pandemic around COVID? How do we address things like being able to protect employees and customers by having them work from home? How do we adapt to that by being able to provide either Horizon Cloud on Azure service or a Horizon 8 platform on Azure VMware Solution? And then around the adapt, it's really about the resiliency of business. Again, to evolve systems, how do we evolve the processes? How do we evolve the people's mindset into this new model of being able to work in a very distributed fashion? Things like on-demand scaling, cost efficiency, resource optimization, how do we address that from this new model of being able to work remotely, but also to be able to expand our business? And then accelerate, that's really the phase we're approaching. How do we start to deliver this digital first concept, and how do we move into a cloud environment to, again, accelerate our business, but also reduce all the different expenditures that we have today? And again, really to future-proof our business by leveraging the Azure native services, by being able to migrate from on-prem into the cloud and back, to have that flexibility and do that application modernization. So again, my name is Jeffrey Moore. I'm the lead architect for Azure VMware Solution on the VMware side. We've covered this design discussion around the use case of the global pandemic around COVID. I think it's provided the framework how to go through discussions regarding what Azure VMware Solution is, how we apply things like Horizon Cloud or Horizon 8, how we leverage things for migration regarding hybrid cloud extension, and more importantly, how do we use things within the native Azure portfolio. And on that, I want to thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn. Thank you.